After the storm, a ranger discovers a strange place deep inside a national park that doesn't appear on any map. And what he finds inside is so disturbing that the thought of calling 911 crosses his mind, because it becomes clear this place was hidden for a reason and someone may have returned here very recently. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the wind that had torn through the park during the night. When the ranger arrived at the station early in the morning, the air still smelled of wet bark and cold earth, and the clouds hung low, stretched thin across a pale sky. Storms were nothing new here, but this one had been different. Even from the safety of his cabin, he had heard trees snapping like dry bones and felt the ground tremble under sudden gusts that came from no clear direction. By the time he set out on patrol, the park looked wounded. The main access road was littered with branches, some as thick as a man's torso. Several trail signs leaned at unnatural angles, their posts half pulled from the softened soil. In low-lying areas, muddy water had spilled over paths, erasing footprints and turning familiar ground into something uncertain. His task was routine in name only: inspect the remote sectors, check for stranded hikers, assess damage, and report anything that posed a danger. After storms like this, surprises were common. Sometimes they were small and inconvenient. Sometimes they were not. He drove as far as the road allowed, then continued on foot, following a service route that never appeared on tourist maps. It was an old path, originally cut decades ago for maintenance and emergency access, and over the years it had nearly been reclaimed by the forest. He knew it well: every bend, every slope, every place where water liked to collect after heavy rain. Or at least he thought he did. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Birds were slow to return after the storm, and the usual background noise of the park felt muted, as if the forest itself were listening. Fallen trees forced him to detour more than once, climbing over slick trunks and pushing aside tangled branches. At one point, he had to stop and mark a section for later clearing. A large pine had come down directly across the route, its roots torn from the ground and still dripping with mud. It was just beyond that fallen pine that he noticed something wrong. The storm had torn open a stretch of forest that had always been dense and nearly impassable. Several trees lay uprooted, and others leaned at awkward angles, creating a wide break where sunlight now spilled onto the ground. He slowed instinctively, scanning the area. The clearing should not have been there. This part of the park had always been thick, a natural barrier that funneled both wildlife and people away from the interior. He had walked this route dozens of times over the years and never once seen more than a narrow corridor between trunks. Now through the gap, he saw something that made him stop completely. At the center of the clearing stood a structure. It was a wooden house, small but unmistakably solid, raised slightly above the ground. What made it impossible to dismiss as a trick of the light or a temporary shelter were the wheels beneath it. Large, old wooden wheels, reinforced with metal rims darkened by rust, supported the entire weight of the building. The house rested unevenly, as if the ground beneath it had shifted recently, but it stood firm, its frame straight and deliberate. For several seconds he did not move. His first thought was that it had to be some kind of historical exhibit, perhaps a relocated artifact or an old logging remnant that had been forgotten in the records. But the location made no sense. There were no markers, no fences, no signs of recent maintenance. And more importantly, he knew the maps. He knew the archives. Nothing like this existed here. He approached slowly, eyes fixed on the structure. The wood was darkened with age, boards warped slightly but intact. The roof was pitched and covered in old wooden shingles, many of them cracked but still in place. A narrow chimney rose from one corner, capped with rusted metal. The windows were small and rectangular, some of the glass gone, others clouded with grime. It did not look abandoned in the careless way that forgotten things usually did. It looked left behind. He circled the house, keeping a careful distance at first. Years of training made him methodical. Before anything else, he checked the surroundings. No voices, no movement, no smell of smoke or fuel. The forest was still. As he drew closer, his eyes went to the wheels. They were old, badly weathered. The wood cracked and swollen from decades of moisture. Moss crept along the lower edges and rust flaked from the metal rims. Everything about them suggested that they had not been turned in years. And yet the ground told a different story. Beneath the wheels, the soil was disturbed. The storm had softened the earth, turning it dark and pliable, and in that surface he could clearly see compressed tracks. Not ancient impressions half erased by time, but fresh ones. Grass was bent and broken. Small roots had been torn free. The marks followed a short, uneven line, as if the house had been shifted slightly, dragged or rolled just far enough to settle into its current position. He crouched down to examine them more closely. The edges of the impressions were sharp. Rainwater had collected in them, but had not yet smoothed them away. Whatever had moved this house had done so recently. Very recently. A familiar unease settled in his chest. The idea that someone had been here, deep in the park, moving a structure this large without authorization, was troubling enough. The idea that they had done so quietly without leaving obvious tracks beyond this clearing was worse. He stood and looked around again, scanning the tree line for signs of a vehicle path, a winch line, anything that would explain how the house had been repositioned. There was nothing obvious. The forest swallowed the clearing at its edges, dense and watchful. He took out his phone and documented what he could. Coordinates, photographs of the structure, close-ups of the wheels and the tracks beneath them. He noted the direction the marks suggested the house had been moved from, committing it to memory. Every detail mattered. Only after that did he approach the door. The door was wooden, thick, reinforced with an old metal latch. It was closed but not locked. He paused, listening again, then placed a gloved hand on the handle and pushed gently. The hinges protested with a low creak that sounded far too loud in the quiet clearing. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of old wood, dust, and something else beneath it, something domestic and familiar. He stepped inside carefully, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the small windows. The interior was not chaotic. There was no sense of abandonment born of haste. Instead, everything appeared arranged with care. A narrow table stood against one wall, its surface cleared except for a neatly stacked pile of folders. Shelves lined another wall, holding containers, jars, and small tools, all placed deliberately. Against the far wall hung a uniform. He recognized it immediately. It was a ranger's uniform, but not like the one he wore. The cut was older, the fabric heavier. The insignia stitched onto the chest was faded but unmistakable, belonging to an era he knew only from photographs and museum displays. The sight of it sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the lingering cold of the storm. He stepped closer, his attention drawn to the folders on the table. They were arranged in a precise stack, edges aligned, protected from dust by a thin cloth. When he lifted the top one, he saw handwritten notes, dates, times. The earliest entries were from the 1970s. As he stood there, the weight of the discovery settled over him. This was no random shelter, no forgotten relic. This was something deliberate, something hidden, a structure that did not exist on any map, in any archive, yet stood solid and real in the heart of the park. And the fresh tracks beneath its rusted wheels told him one thing with unsettling clarity. Someone had not only known about this place, someone had been here recently. For a long moment after stepping inside, the ranger did nothing but stand still. The storm-damp forest behind him felt distant now, sealed off by the thick wooden door. Inside the house, the silence was different. It was not the empty quiet of abandonment, but the careful stillness of a place that had once been used with purpose and then left to wait. He closed the door behind him, not fully, just enough to block the wind and keep the light steady. His training took over. He began with the basics, moving slowly, deliberately, taking in the space as a whole before focusing on any single object. The interior was compact but efficient, built to be lived in rather than admired. The ceiling was low, the beams exposed and darkened with age. The floorboards creaked faintly under his weight, but felt solid. Light entered through two narrow windows, dusted and scratched, turning the air into thin bands of gray and gold. In that light, the house revealed itself not as a ruin, but as a working place preserved in time. He moved first to the table he had noticed upon entry. The folders were not random. They were aligned as if someone had taken care to leave them in order. He removed the cloth covering them and set it aside. The paper beneath was yellowed but dry, protected from moisture and decay. He opened the first folder and immediately recognized the structure of the notes. Dates were written neatly at the top of each page, followed by times, weather conditions, and short observations. Truck sounds after midnight. Unusual lights near the old access road, the distant echo of chainsaws long after legal working hours. Some entries were brief, others stretched across entire pages, detailed and precise. This was not the work of an amateur. This was documentation. As he continued reading, a pattern emerged. The entries followed a rotating schedule, marked with initials at the bottom of each page. Different handwriting appeared throughout the folder, similar but not identical. More than one person had used this place, sharing the same method, the same quiet urgency. He checked the dates more carefully. The earliest entries began in the early 1970s. The most recent ones in the folder stopped abruptly less than a year later. The second folder contained maps, not official park maps, but hand-drawn diagrams layered over photocopies of existing terrain charts. Certain areas were circled. Others were marked with symbols he did not immediately recognize. Arrows indicated movement patterns. Routes appeared and disappeared across different versions of the same map, suggesting that whatever was being observed was not static. He leaned closer, tracing one of the routes with his finger. It ran along a section of the park that bordered private land, a place where oversight had always been thin. He remembered that area. Even now it was a problem zone, a place where rangers were stretched too thin to patrol regularly. The third folder changed the tone entirely. Inside were typed reports, official in appearance but lacking formal headers. The language was careful, restrained, but beneath it he sensed tension. Mentions of unauthorized operations, references to external pressure, notes indicating that findings had been shared verbally rather than committed to paper. Several pages were stamped with the word confidential, though the stamp itself looked homemade. He turned page after page, his unease growing. The reports described illegal logging operations that operated at night, moving quickly and leaving little trace. They mentioned trucks with covered plates, equipment stored temporarily on protected land, and shipments that did not align with any permits. And woven through all of it was a single recurring phrase, written differently each time but unmistakable in meaning: stop asking questions. At the back of the folder was a final page, handwritten, different from the rest. The ink was darker, pressed harder into the paper. Project suspended. Effective immediately. All personnel reassigned. Do not return to the site. There was no signature. He set the folder down slowly and looked around again, seeing the space differently now. The house was not simply a shelter. It was a mobile observation post deliberately constructed to be moved, hidden, repositioned as needed. The wheels beneath it were not an afterthought. They were the point. Whoever had designed this place had known that permanence was a liability. His gaze went to the uniform hanging on the wall. He approached it carefully, as if it might dissolve at his touch. The fabric was heavy, wool blend, faded but intact. The cut was unmistakably from decades past, the style long retired. The patches were sewn on by hand, their edges frayed. A name tag had once been attached above the pocket, but it had been removed, leaving only the faint outline of thread holes. He ran his fingers along the sleeve, feeling the texture, the weight. This uniform had been worn here, in this house, by someone who had stood watch in the dark, listening to the forest and waiting for signs of activity that no one else was supposed to know about. Below the uniform, mounted on a narrow shelf, lay a notebook smaller than the others. Unlike the folders, it showed signs of wear. The corners were bent. The spine was cracked. This was not an official record. This was personal. He hesitated before opening it, then did so gently. The entries inside were different, less structured, more emotional. The early pages mirrored the observational tone of the reports, but as he read on, frustration crept into the words. Mentions of meetings that led nowhere, of supervisors who refused to listen, of warnings delivered indirectly, wrapped in polite language. Then the tone shifted again. Names began to appear, scratched out or abbreviated. Dates were circled. One entry mentioned a colleague who had not returned from a routine check along the eastern boundary. Another described a search that had been called off too quickly. The writer questioned the official explanation, the lack of follow-up, the silence that followed. The last entry was short. If this ends badly, the house stays hidden. Someone might need it later. There were no entries after that. The ranger closed the notebook and exhaled slowly. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him, not as shock, but as a creeping sense of responsibility. This place had been built to see what others pretended not to see, and it had been shut down because it worked too well. He turned away from the table and began to examine the rest of the interior more closely. The shelves held jars of dried food, labeled carefully with dates that aligned with the observation period. There were old batteries, a pair of binoculars with scratched lenses, a hand-cranked radio whose casing was dented but intact. Everything spoke of careful preparation, of people who had expected to be here for a long time. And then he noticed what did not belong. Near the back wall, partially hidden behind a crate, was a small metal stove. It was not part of the original setup. Its design was simpler, more improvised. Nearby lay a medical kit, the kind used by families rather than field teams. Inside it were children's pain relievers, adhesive bandages with faded cartoon characters, and a thermometer that had been handled often. His eyes moved slowly across the space now, noticing details he had overlooked before. A hook near the ceiling with a length of string tied to it, perhaps once holding a lantern at a different height. A shelf that bore the faint outline of something rectangular that was no longer there. A chalk mark on the wall, half erased, at about a child's eye level. This house had not stopped being used when the project ended. It had changed hands. He stood in the center of the room, the two stories overlapping in his mind. The official operation, secret and dangerous in its own way. And something else that came after, quieter, more desperate, rooted not in investigation, but in survival. The thought unsettled him more than the evidence of corruption ever could. Someone had found this hidden place and turned it into a refuge. Someone had lived here long enough to leave traces that were unmistakably human. He stepped back toward the door and looked once more at the folders on the table. The past was neatly arranged, waiting. The present, however, was not as orderly. The fresh tracks outside, the signs of recent movement, suggested that this story had not been sealed away as completely as it appeared. As he reached for the handle to step back into the clearing, one realization settled firmly in his mind. This house was not forgotten. It was being watched. When the ranger stepped back inside the house later that afternoon, it no longer felt like an unfamiliar structure hidden in the forest. The silence was the same, the light unchanged, yet his perception of the place had shifted. What had first appeared as a frozen fragment of the past now felt layered, as if multiple lives had passed through these walls, each leaving traces that refused to disappear completely. He closed the door again and stood still, letting his eyes move slowly across the interior. This time, he did not focus on the folders or the uniform. He looked instead for what did not belong to an observation post. The stove near the back wall drew his attention first. Up close, it was clearly improvised, assembled from mismatched parts. The metal was scorched unevenly, and the vent pipe had been bent and refitted more than once. Someone had used it regularly, carefully controlling the fire to avoid smoke that could be seen from a distance. The ashtray was clean, emptied deliberately, not neglected. He crouched and examined the floor around it. The wood bore darker marks where heat had been absorbed over time. These were not the marks of brief use. They spoke of seasons, of repeated cold nights when warmth was not a luxury, but a necessity. Nearby stood a small crate, its lid loose. Inside were a few canned goods, their labels faded but readable, arranged not as supplies forgotten, but as items counted and rationed. He checked the dates stamped into the metal. They spanned several years beyond the time when the observation project had been shut down. Whoever lived here afterward had stayed long enough to plan ahead. He straightened and moved along the wall, running his fingers lightly across the shelves. The tools were mixed now. Field instruments from the original operation shared space with household items. A chipped mug, a bent spoon, a sewing needle threaded with coarse string. Each object seemed insignificant on its own, yet together they formed a quiet narrative. His gaze settled on the drawings. They were pinned to the wall with small nails, some rusted, others newer. The paper had yellowed unevenly, curling at the edges. The drawings were simple, clearly made by a child. Crayon lines depicted trees taller than houses, a boxy structure on wheels, stick figures holding hands. In one drawing, a small sun hovered above the forest, exaggerated and bright. He leaned closer. In the corner of one sheet, written in careful, uncertain letters, was a date. It was decades later than the last official entry in the observation logs. A family had lived here. The realization did not come with surprise, only with clarity. The signs had been there all along. The medical kit stocked with items no ranger team would carry. The improvised stove. The care taken to keep the place orderly. This had not been a temporary hideout. This had been a home, however fragile and precarious. He moved toward the sleeping area, separated from the rest of the space by a narrow partition. The bedding was gone, but the floor beneath showed where a mattress had rested for years. The wood was smoothed by movement, worn in the places where someone had knelt, where a child might have sat and played quietly. A hook on the beam above still held a short length of rope. He imagined it supporting a lantern, positioned low, its light carefully shielded from the windows. Whoever lived here had known how to disappear. He found more evidence of routine as he continued his inspection. A small rainwater collection system attached to the roof gutter, feeding into a covered barrel behind the house. The barrel was empty now, but its interior was clean. Someone had cared enough to maintain it until recently. He noticed footprints around it as well, shallow impressions in the damp soil that matched neither his boots nor the older tracks near the wheels. The idea unsettled him. The house had not merely survived the end of its original purpose. It had adapted. It had become something else entirely. He returned inside and sat briefly at the table, letting the implications settle. The observation post had been built to avoid detection. Its secrecy had made it the perfect refuge for someone who needed to vanish. Someone who trusted the forest more than the legal system beyond its borders. He thought back to the notebook, to the final line about leaving the house hidden for someone who might need it later. Whether that sentence had been meant literally or metaphorically, it had proven true. As he studied the drawings again, his thoughts shifted from the house to the people who had lived within it. A man, a woman, a child, perhaps more than one. They had moved this heavy structure through the forest, slowly, carefully, leaving minimal trace. He imagined the effort it would take, the planning, the constant fear of discovery. This was not the life of criminals confident in their power. This was the life of people running from something they could not face openly. The ranger stood and began to reconstruct their routine in his mind. They would have moved at dawn or dusk when visibility was low and the forest itself offered cover. They would have avoided main paths, sticking to ground softened by rain or covered by leaf litter to hide tracks. The wheels, old as they were, would have creaked unless padded or greased. Even the sound would have been managed. He stepped outside again and walked the perimeter with new eyes. The clearing had not formed randomly, it had been chosen. The fallen trees created natural barriers, blocking lines of sight. The house sat at a slight incline, allowing rainwater to drain away from the foundation. From certain angles, it blended into the forest shadows almost perfectly. Someone had understood this land deeply. The ranger paused near the rear of the house, where the forest thickened. There, partially concealed by undergrowth, he noticed a faint trail. It was not a path in the usual sense, but a repeated disturbance of ground and vegetation that suggested frequent use over a long period. It led away from the clearing, winding toward a ravine where the terrain dropped sharply and sound would carry poorly. He followed it a short distance, then stopped. For now it was enough to know it existed. Every new discovery carried weight, and he needed to be careful not to rush. Back inside, he returned to the papers, this time reading them alongside the signs of family life. The contrast was striking. On one hand, meticulous records of illegal activity and pressure from above. On the other, evidence of quiet endurance, of people trying to live invisibly. The connection between the two began to take shape. If the original project had been shut down to protect powerful interests, those same interests might have been responsible for whatever drove the family into hiding. The house, designed to observe crimes, had become a shield against injustice. He gathered his thoughts and began making careful notes of his own. Not official reports, not yet. Personal observations, dates, relationships, questions. He wrote down the date on the child's drawing, the last entry in the ranger's notebook, the gap between them. The timeline mattered. As the light outside shifted, growing warmer and lower, he realized how much time had passed. He felt the weight of the forest pressing in again, a reminder that he was not alone here. The fresh tracks beneath the wheels and near the water barrel returned to his mind with renewed urgency. Someone had been here recently, not a curious hiker, not an animal. Someone who knew the house, who knew where to step and where not to. Someone who might be watching even now. The ranger extinguished his flashlight and stood quietly listening. The forest offered only its usual sounds: distant birds, the whisper of leaves, the faint creak of wood settling as the house cooled. Yet the feeling remained. This place was no longer just a relic of the past. It was part of a story that had continued long after the official records ended, and it had not yet reached its conclusion. As he stepped outside for the final time that day and marked the location discreetly, one thought followed him with unsettling clarity. Whatever had driven a family to live hidden in this house had not vanished with time. It had simply learned to wait. The ranger did not return to the house the next morning. Instead, he took the long way back to the station, letting the forest settle behind him while his thoughts moved steadily in the opposite direction, toward records, names, and dates. The discovery in the clearing had shifted something fundamental. What he had found was no longer just a hidden structure or an abandoned operation. It was a question that had waited decades for someone to ask it again. By the time he reached the administrative buildings, the park had returned to its usual rhythm. Crews were already working to clear storm damage from the main roads. Radios crackled with routine updates. Tourists, unaware of how close the forest had come to revealing something far larger than fallen trees, gathered near trailheads with cameras and maps. The contrast felt almost surreal. He did not mention the house to anyone. Instead, he began quietly, the way experienced rangers learn to do when they sense resistance before it appeared. He logged his patrol route in general terms, noting storm damage and blocked paths, but omitting the coordinates of the clearing. Then he moved on to the archives. The park's records room was a narrow space tucked behind administrative offices, lined with metal shelves and heavy filing cabinets that smelled faintly of dust and aging paper. Digital databases had replaced most daily operations years ago, but the older material still lived here, boxed and labeled by decade. He requested access under the pretense of updating historical references for maintenance planning, a task common enough to draw no suspicion. The first thing he learned was how little existed on paper. There were no mentions of a mobile observation post, no records of a structure on wheels, no formal project descriptions that matched what he had read in the house. If such an operation had existed, it had been deliberately excluded from official documentation. That absence spoke louder than any report. He shifted his focus outward, beyond park archives. During his lunch break, he drove into the nearest town and parked behind the public library, a squat brick building that had outlived several generations of residents. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of old books and cleaning solution. He greeted the librarian, an older woman who had worked there long enough to remember when the park's boundaries were redrawn, and asked about local newspaper archives. She pointed him toward the microfilm machines without much curiosity. Few people use them anymore. He fed the first reel into place and began scrolling through the years that matched the dates from the observation logs. At first, the articles were predictable: storms, small fires, tourist incidents, mentions of logging disputes that read like bureaucratic footnotes. Then gradually he began to notice patterns. Short articles appeared late at night in the pages, tucked between advertisements and obituaries. Reports of trucks seen where they did not belong. Complaints from residents about noise after dark. Mentions of equipment moving through restricted areas without permits. None of the stories were pursued beyond a paragraph or two. They appeared once, sometimes twice, then vanished. And then he found the case. The headline was small, printed in the same restrained typeface as everything else, but the wording stopped him cold. A man accused of a violent crime had failed to appear in court. His wife and young child were also missing. Authorities believed the family had fled. A photograph accompanied the article, grainy and poorly reproduced, showing a man with tired eyes and a guarded expression. He stared back at the ranger from decades past. frozen in the moment before his life had fractured. The article did not dwell on details. It mentioned evidence without listing it. It quoted officials who spoke of a strong case and an ongoing investigation. It ended by encouraging anyone with information to come forward. The ranger advanced the reel. Days later, another article appeared. A brief update. Search efforts had been suspended. No trace of the family had been found. The tone suggested closure, though nothing had been resolved. The story drifted away, replaced by others, until it became part of the quiet background of the town's history. He continued scrolling, heart pounding slightly, searching for any mention of resolution. It took him nearly an hour to find it. Years later, buried deep in the paper, was a correction. New evidence had surfaced. Key testimony had been discredited. The charges were formally withdrawn. The man's name was cleared. There was no photograph this time, no interview, no apology. The ranger leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The room felt suddenly smaller. The implications settled slowly, assembling themselves with quiet precision. The family had fled not because they were guilty, but because the system had turned against them. They had vanished into the forest at a time when no one was looking for innocence, only for closure, and somewhere during that flight, they had found the house. He returned to the reels and searched for geographic references. In one early article, a passing sentence mentioned that the alleged crime had occurred near a forest access road that bordered protected land. Another article referenced a ranger station that had since been decommissioned. The dots connected reluctantly but unmistakably. The forest had not been a random refuge. It had been the only place where the family could exist without being seen. Back at the station later that afternoon, he reviewed internal incident logs from the same period. Most were routine: fires, injuries, maintenance issues. Then he found a short entry that stood out by its brevity. A ranger listed as missing after failing to return from a night patrol near the eastern boundary. The follow-up was sparse. A search conducted. No findings. Case closed. The name matched the initials from the notebook in the house. The ranger felt a slow tightening in his chest. This was no coincidence. The observation project, the illegal operations, the missing ranger, the falsely accused man, and the family who vanished into the forest were not separate threads. They were strands of the same rope, twisted together by time and deliberate silence. He reached out to one of the park's senior employees, a man nearing retirement who had started his career in the same era as the observation logs. Their conversation was casual at first, framed around storm damage and budget constraints. Then carefully, the ranger asked about unusual assignments in the 1970s. The response was immediate, though subtle: a hesitation, a shift in posture. "There were things we didn't talk about back then," the man said finally. "Better left buried." That was all he would offer. The ranger left the conversation with more certainty than before. Silence had not been accidental. It had been enforced not through threats, but through careers, reputations, and the quiet understanding that some truths carried consequences too heavy to bear. That evening, he returned to his notes and laid everything out in sequence. The creation of a mobile observation post to monitor illegal activity. Pressure applied to shut it down. A ranger who disappeared while doing his job. A family accused of a crime without sufficient evidence, forced into hiding. A house that moved through the forest, sheltering both truth and survival. And then, the fresh tracks. Someone had returned to that house after all these years, not to live, but to check, to make sure nothing remained that could reopen what had been sealed. The ranger stared at the timeline he had sketched out, the dates forming a quiet accusation on the page. The past was not dormant. It was active, maintained by those who feared what it contained. As darkness settled outside his window, he felt the weight of an unspoken decision pressing closer. He could not unknow what he had learned. The forest had yielded its secret, not with drama or violence, but with patience. And patience, he understood now, was often the most dangerous force of all. The ranger returned to the clearing 2 days later, choosing the hour with care. He went early before the park fully woke, when the light was still low and the air carried the damp coolness of night. The decision to wait had not been easy. Every instinct urged him to go back immediately after uncovering the truth in the archives, but he had learned long ago that haste was how details were missed. Whatever had happened here decades ago had survived precisely because it moved slowly and deliberately. He intended to do the same. The forest felt different now, not hostile, not threatening, but alert. He found himself listening more closely to every sound, watching the spaces between trees instead of the paths beneath his feet. The storm damage had begun to settle. Broken branches lay where they had fallen, leaves already drying, their sharp scent fading. Yet the sense that something had been disturbed lingered, subtle but undeniable. As the clearing came into view, he stopped short of stepping into it. From the edge of the trees, he studied the house. At a distance, it looked unchanged, resting on its old wheels as if it had always belonged there. But he knew better now. He knew that appearances meant little. He approached slowly, circling wide, scanning the ground. The tracks beneath the wheels were still visible, though softened slightly by time and weather. He knelt beside one and pressed his fingers into the soil nearby. It was firmer than it had been when he first arrived, but the impression remained clear enough to confirm what he already knew. The house had not been moved during the storm. It had been moved after. He followed the marks outward, careful not to step on them. They did not extend far, only a short distance, as if the structure had been adjusted rather than relocated. A correction, not an escape. Whoever had moved it had known exactly where they wanted it to be. His attention shifted to the surrounding ground. This time he was not looking for the obvious signs of age, but for interruption, and he found it. Near the rear of the house, where the rainwater barrel stood, the soil bore a different set of impressions. They were shallow, recent, and distinct from the older disturbances. Footprints, adult-sized, heavy enough to compress the wet earth, light enough to leave no drag marks. The tread pattern was modern, not the type worn by hikers or park staff. He felt a tightness settle in his chest. Someone had been here since his last visit. He stood and scanned the clearing again, his senses sharpening. Nothing moved. The forest remained quiet, offering no confirmation or denial. He noted the footprints carefully, tracing their direction. They led around the house toward the side where the foundation dipped slightly, then vanished into leaf litter that had already begun to dry. He took out his phone and photographed everything: the tracks, the wheels, the disturbed ground near the barrel. He resisted the urge to follow the footprints immediately. If someone had come and gone without leaving more obvious signs, it meant they knew how to move through this terrain. Following blindly would serve no purpose. Inside the house, the air felt unchanged, but his awareness of it had sharpened. He stepped across the threshold and paused, listening. No sounds but the faint settling of wood. No new scents. No sign of recent fire. At first glance, nothing appeared out of place. The folders were still stacked neatly. The uniform still hung on the wall. The drawings remained pinned where he had seen them last. It would have been easy to assume that the visitor had simply come and left without touching anything, but the ranger knew better now. He began a methodical search, not disturbing objects, but studying them with renewed attention. He looked for absence rather than presence. It did not take long. One of the floorboards near the sleeping area sat slightly lower than the others. The difference was subtle, the kind of detail that escaped casual notice. But he had spent enough time in this space to recognize it immediately. He knelt and ran his hand along the seam. The board shifted under pressure. He lifted it carefully. Beneath was a shallow compartment, no deeper than his hand. Dust coated the bottom, except for a rectangular area where something had rested. The dust there was smeared, disturbed recently, the edges sharp. The compartment was empty. He closed his eyes briefly and exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Whatever had been hidden here, someone had come back for it, and they had done so quietly, efficiently, without taking anything else. He replaced the board and stood, his mind racing through possibilities. Documents, a recording, a list of names, something small enough to conceal, valuable enough to retrieve decades later. Something that could connect the missing ranger, the illegal operations, and the family who had lived here. He turned slowly, scanning the room again. The visitor had not searched blindly. They had gone straight to the compartment. That meant one thing. They had known it was there. Outside, the forest remained still, but the ranger felt watched in a way he could not dismiss. He stepped back into the clearing and walked its perimeter once more, this time widening his search. Near the edge of the trees, he found another sign. A broken twig bent downward, snapped recently, a faint scuff mark on a rock that had been cleaned the day before. He followed these signs a short distance, stopping before the terrain dropped toward the ravine he had noticed earlier. The slope beyond was steep and shadowed, its floor hidden by undergrowth. Sound would travel poorly there. Movement would be concealed. He did not go farther. As he returned to the house, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The suddenness of it made his pulse jump. He checked the screen. No message. No missed call. Just a brief loss of signal. He frowned and slipped the phone away, unsettled by how easily his mind leapt to conclusions. He reminded himself that reception in this part of the park was unreliable. Still, the timing felt wrong. He took one last look at the clearing before leaving, committing every detail to memory. The angle of the house, the position of the wheels, the subtle changes in the ground. When he finally turned away, he did so with the certainty that he was no longer investigating a forgotten story. He was stepping into an active one. Back at the station later that day, he tried to act as if nothing had changed. He filed routine reports, responded to radio calls, spoke with colleagues about storm repairs. But beneath it all, his awareness remained sharp, attuned to small shifts in tone and timing. It was during a casual conversation near the end of his shift that the first real warning arrived. One of the administrative supervisors mentioned his name in passing, asking another ranger where he had been assigned earlier that week. The question was phrased lightly without accusation, but the timing was precise. Too precise. The ranger answered for himself, keeping his response vague. Storm patrols, back routes, damage assessment. All true, all incomplete. That night, as he drove home, he noticed a vehicle pulled off near the edge of the road where there was no obvious reason to stop. The engine was off. The windows dark. It could have been nothing. A stranded motorist, a hunter, someone waiting for daylight. But when he passed, the headlights flickered on briefly, then went dark again. He did not slow down. At home, he reviewed his notes, cross-checking times and details. He added the empty compartment to the timeline, marking it clearly. Whatever had been taken from the house had survived decades untouched. Someone had waited until now to retrieve it. Why now? The answer formed slowly, unwelcome but unavoidable. The storm had revealed the house. It had exposed a place that was meant to remain hidden. Someone had realized this before the ranger had even begun to connect the dots, and they had moved quickly. As he lay awake that night, listening to the wind move through the trees outside his window, one thought returned again and again, refusing to settle. If someone was willing to come back for the truth after all these years, it meant they feared it more now than they ever had before. The next morning began the way most mornings in the park did, with routine asserting itself as if nothing had shifted beneath it. Radios crackled with familiar voices. Maintenance schedules were adjusted. Weather reports were read aloud and forgotten. The ranger moved through it all with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning how to blend into the background when necessary. But beneath the surface, the previous days pressed against him with increasing weight. The empty compartment beneath the floorboard, the footprints by the barrel, the quiet question asked by a supervisor that lingered longer than it should have, all of it pointed in the same direction. He was no longer alone with what he knew. The decision before him did not announce itself dramatically. It did not arrive with raised voices or urgent commands. Instead, it crept forward in smaller moments, in pauses between conversations, in the awareness that every choice from now on would carry consequences he could not fully predict. If he filed a formal report about the house, the process would be swift and impersonal. The site would be cataloged, sealed, and transferred into administrative custody. Investigators would arrive, some genuinely curious, others merely cautious. Documents would be removed, classified, misplaced. The house would be stripped of its context and reduced to an anomaly in a system that had already proven itself willing to forget. If he stayed silent, the truth would remain buried in the forest, guarded only by his memory and whatever fragments still lay hidden beyond reach. The house would continue to exist as it had for decades, waiting. But silence would also mean accepting that the ranger who had disappeared, the family that had vanished, and the effort to expose wrongdoing would never be acknowledged. Silence would mean complicity, even if it felt like self-preservation. He tried to imagine explaining the discovery to his superiors, the absence of records, the unofficial nature of the operation, the implications of corruption that stretched back further than most current employees' careers. He could already hear the responses, measured and careful, concerns about jurisdiction, questions about evidence handling, warnings about drawing conclusions without full context. He had seen this process before, though never from this side of it. It rarely ended with clarity. More often, it ended with exhaustion. Late that afternoon, he sought out one of the park's longest-serving employees, a man whose office still bore the marks of an era when paperwork was handwritten and decisions were made face-to-face. The man listened as the ranger spoke in general terms, careful not to reveal too much, framing his questions as historical curiosity rather than accusation. The older ranger's eyes shifted slightly as the conversation deepened, his hands folded together on the desk, knuckles pale. Some things, he said slowly, were handled differently back then. There were understandings. If you pushed too hard, you didn't last. He did not ask for clarification. He did not need to. The warning was clear enough. Later, the ranger drove beyond the park boundaries to a small diner that had survived long enough to become invisible. He ordered coffee and listened to the low murmur of conversations around him, scanning faces he half recognized. The town had changed since the 1970s, but not completely. Families stayed, stories lingered. At the counter, he struck up a conversation with a man whose age matched the era he had been researching. The talk began with weather and road conditions, then drifted cautiously toward memories of the park's past. When the ranger mentioned night activity decades ago, the man's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. People knew things weren't right, the man said after a pause, but knowing and proving aren't the same. When the ranger asked about the missing family, the man shook his head. They were gone before anyone realized how wrong it all was. That night, alone in his house, the ranger laid out his notes across the table. He organized them carefully, aligning dates and events, building a structure that made sense not just to him, but to anyone who might see it later. He photographed documents again, ensuring clarity. He backed up images to multiple devices, labeling them with neutral file names that would not draw attention. He considered who could be trusted with this information. Internal channels offered authority but little protection. External ones offered exposure but carried their own risks. He thought of an investigator he had met years earlier, someone who had left public service under ambiguous circumstances but still worked quietly on cases others avoided. He thought of journalists who specialized not in headlines, but in long, patient investigations that unfolded slowly, safely. The plan formed gradually, shaped by caution rather than urgency. He would not announce the discovery. He would not rush to confront anyone. Instead, he would ensure that the truth could not be erased by a single decision or a closed-door meeting. Copies would exist beyond his reach. Timelines would be established. Evidence would be preserved. As the night wore on, his phone buzzed softly on the table, an unfamiliar number. He let it ring once before answering. The voice on the other end was calm, almost friendly. There was no introduction, no threat. Just a question, asked casually, about how storm assessments were progressing in the remote sectors. The ranger answered in general terms, keeping his voice steady. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the call disconnected without farewell. He sat still for a long time afterward, staring at the dark screen. The message had been delivered without words. Do not go further. The next day, small things began to accumulate. A delay in approving routine equipment requests, a supervisor's sudden interest in his schedule, a park vehicle parked closer to his house than usual, its presence easy to dismiss and impossible to ignore. None of it was overt. None of it could be formally challenged. Together it formed a pattern. Pressure, applied gently. He responded by becoming more careful. He altered his routine slightly. He avoided predictable paths. He spoke less and listened more. When he returned to the house in the forest, he did so briefly, confirming that nothing else had been changed, that the silence remained intact. Standing there once more, surrounded by the quiet testimony of wood and paper and absence, he understood the nature of the choice before him more clearly than ever. This was not a decision between safety and danger. It was a decision between responsibility and surrender. As he left the clearing for the last time that week, he did not look back. He had already committed himself, not with a dramatic gesture, but with the steady resolve of someone who understood that truth did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived quietly and waited to see who would carry it forward. The ranger returned to the forest at dusk, choosing the hour when the park balanced between presence and absence. Day visitors were already gone, their voices fading with the light, and night had not yet fully claimed the trails. It was the quiet interval he knew best, the one that belonged neither to routine nor to rest. The storm's damage had been largely cleared by now, but the clearing where the house stood remained untouched, as if the forest itself had agreed to preserve it. He approached without haste, moving the way he always had when the land mattered more than speed. Every sound was familiar: the distant call of a bird settling for the night, the soft crack of branches cooling after a warm day, the whisper of leaves stirred by a breeze too light to feel on the skin. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing promised safety either. The house appeared between the trees exactly as it had before. The wheels were still, the boards were dark and weathered. The structure looked less like an intrusion now, and more like an old scar the forest had learned to carry. He stood for a moment at the edge of the clearing, taking it in not as a discovery, but as a conclusion. Inside, the light was low. He did not turn on his flashlight immediately. He knew the space well enough now to navigate it by memory. The table, the shelves, the wall where the uniform hung, unmoving, its presence both comforting and unsettling. He ran his hand along the edge of the table, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time, and allowed himself to reconstruct the final shape of the story. The mobile observation post had been created to watch crimes that thrived in darkness. It had succeeded too well. Pressure had come swiftly, quietly, and effectively. The project had ended. A ranger had vanished. The truth had been reduced to fragments hidden in paper and memory. Then years later, a family had arrived, not knowing the full history of the house, only recognizing it for what it was: a place designed not to be seen. They had lived carefully. They had moved when they needed to. They had taught a child to draw quietly, to speak softly, to trust the forest more than the world beyond it. When the charges against the father were finally dismissed, the house no longer had a purpose. Whatever choice the family made afterward, they had not returned. The ranger knelt by the spot where the floorboard concealed the empty compartment. He did not lift it again. He did not need to. The absence was enough. Someone else had completed the circle, retrieving whatever final piece had been left behind, hoping perhaps that doing so would restore silence. But silence, he understood now, was fragile. He stepped outside and walked slowly around the house one last time, studying the ground. The tracks had faded further, blending back into the earth. The forest was already reclaiming what had been disturbed. If he did nothing, it would all disappear again. The clearing would close. The wheels would sink. The house would become a rumor even to those who walked past it without knowing. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. Not to take pictures this time, but to check the time. It was late enough. He had planned carefully, setting events in motion days earlier, without drawing attention to himself. Copies of documents had already been sent, encrypted and anonymized. A timeline mattered now, not a single revelation. Truth survived best when it was distributed. He did not imagine an ending where everything was resolved neatly. There would be questions. There would be denials. There might be consequences he could not see yet, but there would also be a record, one that could not be erased as easily as it had been before. Standing there, he felt neither triumph nor fear, only a steady sense of alignment, as if something long out of balance had begun to settle. Before leaving, he did one final thing. He did not lock the door. It was a small gesture, almost symbolic, but it mattered. The house had never been meant to be sealed away permanently. It had existed to observe, to shelter, to endure. Closing it now would have been an act of possession. Leaving it as it was felt more honest. As he walked back into the forest, the trees closed around him, swallowing the clearing from view. The path behind him looked no different from any other stretch of woodland. No sign marked what lay just beyond the bend. No warning announced the weight of what had been uncovered. The ranger did not look back. Somewhere far from the park, others would soon begin to ask questions, following trails that led not through trees, but through files, testimonies, and old decisions brought into new light. The process would be slow. It always was. But it would exist, and the house would remain where it had always been, waiting quietly, not as a refuge or a trap, but as a witness.